I want to begin by saying that I didn't set out to be a writer in any conventional sense. I set out to survive. And survival in the world I grew up in required silence. Silence about what I felt, silence about what I knew, silence about what was happening around me. It took me years to understand that silence becomes not just a habit, but an identity. It shapes how you speak, how you relate, how you even think, and it shapes how you write. Writing for me began as something very small. It was almost like slipping notes under a locked door. I didn't want to announce anything. I wanted to test whether the world could hold a fraction of what I carried. I didn't know it then, but those early writings were the beginnings of a voice that had been waiting decades for permission. When you grow up in a culture or a family or a relationship where your reality is minimized or dismissed, you learn to edit yourself out of your own story. Many women know this intimately. The subtle and not so subtle ways in which we are trained to doubt our own perceptions, to soften our own experiences so others won't feel uncomfortable, and to assume that our pain is our fault. The cost of that is enormous. It isn't just the loss of expression, it's the loss of connection to oneself. Years later, when I began to write seriously, I noticed that the first things I wrote were slightly oblique. They circled around something but didn't land in the center. But they were the right beginning. They were a way of approaching my own voice without overwhelming it. And the more I wrote, the more that voice strengthened. The short stories I published in 2 anthologies were milestones for me, not because they were published, but because they presented moments when I allowed something truer, something much less diluted, to come through on the page. I sometimes think of writing as a process of letting your nervous system uncoil. You can't force it. You can only create conditions where the voice feels safe enough to emerge. Those stories were my first glimpses of what I might be able to say if I stopped trying to protect everyone else from the truth. So last summer, I wrote a monologue that won first prize. That piece surprised me because it came out with a kind of directness I hadn't accessed before. A monologue has nowhere to hide. It forces a kind of intimacy between the writer, the character, and the listener. When I wrote it, it felt as if the words were stepping forward without asking for permission. Sometimes we don't know we've grown until a piece of writing reveals it to us. The monologue told me that my voice had arrived in a new register. And then there is the memoir. I'm now on the 3rd edit. And people sometimes imagine that writing about trauma is cathartic, as if the act itself is cleansing. In my experience, it's something different. It's a negotiation between honesty and care. In the memoir, I'm writing about a time in my life when I was trapped in an ashram, when the psychological and sexual violence was relentless. To write about it is to revisit it, but to revisit it as the person I am now, someone with far more compassion for that younger self, someone who can hold the complexity of it without collapsing into it. So the challenge of a memoir is, how do you tell a story that was once overwhelming without overwhelming the reader? How do you convey the truth without letting trauma become the spectacle? And how do you honour the person you were then, who had so few choices, while giving the reader a sense that there is a through line of survival, dignity, and even transformation? A transformation that reaches outward, asking how one connects with the world once external expectations have shifted. So all my edits have allowed more truth to come through. But it's also allowed me to stay in relationship with myself as I tell it, staying in the present time connection with a part of me that lived through something that was quite unbearable. Writing isn't just relational, it's technical and relational. More broadly, I've come to see that my work sits inside a much larger landscape. The violence to women has been dismissed for centuries. Our authority has been questioned and our perception has been doubted. Our stories, especially the ones involving coercive control, spiritual abuse, sexual violation, psychological harm, are often tidied away because they're inconvenient or even uncomfortable. For many of us, the greatest violence wasn't actually the event itself, but the impact of not being heard, not being met, not being believed, and of people actually not wanting to know. I think of my writing as part of a long lineage of women who have found ways to carve out narrative space where previously there was none. And not in a grand or heroic way, just in a quiet persistence of putting words to experiences that there was a time they were not meant to be spoken. When I look back, I can see that every story I've written has been part of reclaiming that silenced territory. Right now, I'm also writing a novel, Alice, which explores what it's like to be 60 and standing in a life that is both familiar and entirely new. And the book isn't about dramatic events, it's about consciousness. It's about how a woman reconstructs herself when she is no longer willing to live through old survival strategies. It looks at friendship, family, solitude, desire, fatigue, small joys, and the strange clarity that comes when you finally stop trying to earn your place in the world. In some ways, Alice is the story of what happens after a woman has found her voice, how she then chooses to live. And if there's a thread running through everything I write, it's this. Voice is not something you find once. It's something you return to again and again, especially after it's been interrupted. Writing for me is not about producing pages. It's about staying close to the pulse of what is true. It's about allowing the parts of myself that were silenced to speak in a way that feels grounded, coherent, and connected. And I want to end by saying that if you leave with anything from listening to this, let it be an appreciation of how hard-won a woman's voice can be. We don't start from the same place. Some of us begin with decades of silence behind us. But the voice has a way of emerging when we create enough safety around it and when we stay in compassionate contact with ourselves. Writing has been that path for me, and I hope that, in some way, it creates space for others to recognize and reclaim their own.